The night smelled of iron and sweat. Inside the felt-walled chamber, silk curtains stuck damp against the women's shoulders, red with spilled wine and something darker. The girl's wrist trembled as she poured fermented mare's milk into a golden cup, the liquid sloshing while the men outside roared in drunken chants. She was not allowed to drink. She was not allowed to speak. Her silence was part of the ritual. A hand pressed against her back. She flinched. The Khan's guards, their leather soaked with grease, herded her forward like livestock. The great warlord demanded his women presented in rows, jewels jangling at their throats, their eyes lowered, their hair perfumed with crushed pine needles. To falter was dangerous. To weep was forbidden. And yet, in that suffocating air, they could not ignore the truth whispered between clenched teeth. No woman in this tent would ever leave free. They were the spoils of conquest, brides taken from shattered kingdoms, sisters stolen from burning villages, noble daughters dragged from their palaces. Their names were stripped away, replaced with titles that marked only their function. The laughter of soldiers echoed louder, and still the women stood barefoot, the ground beneath them sticky with blood spilled earlier in the day. The Mongol harem was not a paradise of silks and pearls. It was a cage of flesh and obedience, and yet the worst detail was never written in the records. Before the stench of blood and conquest, there was the illusion of order. In the Mongol court, perfection was carefully staged. The yurts of the great Khan shimmered like pale moons across the steppe, their white felt walls stitched with crimson thread. Inside, the air was perfumed with juniper smoke. Brass cauldrons simmered with horsemeat stews, their bubbling interrupted only by the thud of boots and the rustle of silk. At dawn, the women of the harem were awakened not by songbirds but by the crack of a servant's rod striking the frozen earth outside. They were expected to rise quickly. Their lower ranked were made to stand behind, silent shadows whose hands poured wine until wrists ached. Food was ritual. Roasted mutton, cut into precise portions, was placed on polished wooden trays. The women never ate from these platters. Instead, they shared scraps later, gnawing bones licked clean by warriors. Their hunger was hidden, their smiles rehearsed. When the Khan called for entertainment, it was the women who danced. Anklets made of bronze tinkled with each step. The silk at their hips was tied deliberately loose, so a misstep could expose pale skin, a silent reminder that their bodies were possessions as much as the golden bowls on the table. To outsiders, the harem seemed like luxury, women wrapped in silk, surrounded by treasure, guarded from harm. But within, the luxury was suffocation. They were forbidden to write letters, to send word to their families. Their tongues held the taste of salt from tears swallowed quietly, away from the firelight. Some tried to carve secret marks into the felt walls, recording their names in hidden scratches. Others whispered prayers into bowls of water before drinking, believing the spirits of their ancestors would hear. These small rebellions lived like sparks inside the cage, never enough to ignite freedom, but enough to keep the women from sinking entirely into silence. And yet, there were moments of twisted calm. The harem had its own hierarchy. Older women, widowed consorts of fallen Khans, became matriarchs within the walls. They taught the younger captives how to survive, how to kneel at the right angle, how to keep one's eyes lowered without appearing lifeless, how to flatter a warrior without inviting his wrath. Their advice was brutal, but it kept many alive. The women also learned to read the signs of danger, the way Genghis's mood shifted when returning from campaign, the sound of distant drums, announcing new captives would soon arrive, the smell of smoke drifting from beyond the steppe. Another city burned, another group of daughters marching toward. Visitors never saw what happened once the curtains closed, when the women collapsed onto the mats, their breaths shallow, their bodies trembling from the strain of keeping perfection alive. Yet beneath the routine, beneath the rituals, a shadow always lingered. Stories crept through the chambers, carried on hushed breaths, tales of women who had vanished, whose silks were later seen cut into rags by servants, rumours that some had been drowned in rivers after falling out of favour. And always the terrifying truth. No woman left the harem alive unless the Khan decreed it. The illusion of harmony was only a mask stretched thin across terror. Behind every jewel was a bruise, behind every smile a bite mark hidden in flesh. And as the seasons changed on the Mongolian steppe, as new conquests brought new captives, the women began to sense it. The perfection would not hold, the order would fracture, something darker, more violent was coming. And yet, the most dangerous betrayal was still to come. The order cracked not with a roar, but with a whisper. One night, after a feast where roasted lamb still steamed on silver trays and the Khan's laughter echoed like thunder, the chamber fell silent. The women were left kneeling, their ankles pressed into the woven mats until blood pooled beneath their skin. The torches burned low, casting shadows that made the felt walls breathe. And then, a glance was stolen. A young woman, her gown stitched from stolen silk, lifted her eyes toward one of the guards. It was a mistake, or perhaps it was not. His gaze lingered, not cruel, not commanding, but human, a softness that did not belong in this place. For weeks their eyes found each other across the room. When the women danced, his glance followed. When the guards barked orders, his lips pressed together as if holding back words. The harem was built on obedience, but even within chains, desire found cracks to grow. It happened during one of the rituals. Women were ordered. The Khan forbade Christian signs. The harem was alive with secrets, fragile as cobwebs strung across the beams. But webs catch light, and sooner or later, they are seen. It began with small suspicions, a cup left too close to the guard, a braid tied differently than the others as though signalling. Servants began to whisper, and whispers in the Khan's camp travelled faster than arrows. The betrayal deepened with rituals outsiders never saw. When Genghis returned from campaign, the harem was commanded to cleanse him. The women bathed his body in milk mixed with herbs, their hands trembling as they poured water scented with juniper across his scarred skin. It was during these rituals that the guard's absence was noticed. He lingered too long outside, his eyes always searching for one face. The women saw it. The older matriarchs, those who had lived through other Khans, recognized the danger. They whispered warnings to the young concubine. Do not let him look at you. Do not breathe his name. But it was already too late. Desire had burned too deeply. The night of betrayal came with a storm. The yurts groaned under the wind, the fire sputtered, and the Khan demanded wine long after the feast had ended. The young woman stumbled forward with the cup. Her hands shook, not from fear of the Khan, but from the memory of the guard's touch earlier that evening. Genghis noticed. He always noticed. The great warlord did not rise in fury. He leaned back, eyes narrowing, as though studying prey before striking. He asked for the guard by name, a name no woman should have known, a name spoken too often in silence. The room chilled. The guard was summoned, dragged in, his face pale, yet still his eyes found hers. The Khan's laughter was not loud this time. It was quiet, dangerous. He asked her to pour another cup, not for him, but for the guard. When the man drank, the cup was smashed from his lips. Wine dripped like blood across his chin. And then, the worst detail was never written in the records, seeming to burn more cruelly than before. And yet behind that silence, each woman carried her own secret, a memory, a prayer, a forbidden longing that refused to die, because no amount of fear could strip them entirely of what the Khan hated most, the reminder that they were still human. And that humanity was the greatest betrayal of all. The silence after the betrayal was heavier than any chain. The harem had always lived under command, but now it lived under suspicion. The guards who once lingered in shadows now marched openly through the chambers, their sabres unsheathed, their boots crushing the woven mats. Every whispered word was cut short, every glance was swallowed. The women no longer dared to breathe too deeply in one another's presence, for fear their sigh might be mistaken for a secret. The Khan's will was absolute, but what came next was not a single act of fury, it was a slow suffocation. The yurts shrank, not in size but in feeling. The air grew tighter, the torches burned lower, smoke clinging to the walls until every breath felt choked. Women who once hummed softly while braiding each other's hair now sat in silence, their fingers stiff, their lips pressed white. At night, the sound of drums no longer promised feasts or victory, it promised inspection. The Khan's stewards prowled the chambers, demanding to see the women's silks, their bodies, their eyes. They searched for weakness as though it were a stain to be scrubbed away. The Persian singer who had once been forced to perform was silenced, her lute broken in half before her. A Rus maiden's anklets were stripped away, their bells declared too distracting. The harem became bare, stripped of even the illusion of splendour. Every punishment was now a performance. A woman caught weeping was forced to kneel outside the yurt in the snow, her breath freezing into shards that cut her lips. Another was beaten for speaking too loudly, her cries echoing as a warning to the rest. But the most chilling punishments were the ones no one witnessed. Women disappeared in the night. Their mats were left empty, their bowls untouched. No tent reeked not of incense, but of death. These whispers chipped at the empire's aura, even as the Khan continued to conquer cities with fire and steel. Inside, the women found themselves unravelling. Their days blurred into endless rituals stripped of meaning. They were made to pour wine that no one drank, to sing songs no one listened to dance with anklets that no longer jingled. Some broke quietly. One woman stopped speaking altogether, her silence so complete that even the guards avoided her eyes. Another clawed at the felt walls until her fingers bled, convinced there had to be a way out. The older matriarchs whispered prayers for them, but even prayers felt brittle under the weight of fear. And yet, even in collapse, fragments of resistance lingered. The Chinese consort hid scraps of poetry inside the seams of her robe. A Turkic maiden sang lullabies under her breath, too soft for the guards to hear, but enough to remind herself she had once been a daughter, not a captive. The Khan himself remained untouched by the suffocation he created. His campaigns continued. Cities fell. Blood soaked the steppe. But within his own walls, the betrayal festered like a wound. The women who survived carried it in their bones, each day a reminder that one glance, one touch, could unravel everything. The consequences rippled outward. When new captives were brought in, they entered not a gilded cage but a prison suffused with dread. They learned quickly that to smile was dangerous, to speak was fatal, and to hope was a sin. The harem no longer smelled of juniper or silk. It smelled of smoke, iron, and despair. And yet, beneath that despair, something else stirred. The women began to recognize that the Khan feared them too, not as individuals, but as a collective. Their silence, their endurance, their unbroken humanity. These were things even the conqueror could not wholly control. That realization was dangerous, and it was the seed of something the Khan never intended to plant. The illusion of perfection trusted his women again, that he slept with a dagger beneath his pillow, even when surrounded by silks, that he ordered guards to watch the harem not for invaders, but for the women themselves, as though the greatest conqueror feared rebellion not from armies, but from within his own tent. Others claimed something stranger, that one woman, nameless, faceless in the records, escaped. No one could agree on how. Some swore she fled during a storm, vanishing into the night. Others believed she was smuggled out by a servant who pitied her. And some whispered she never escaped at all, but still walked the steppe, her shadow tied to the empire, a ghost that haunted the yurts long after the Khan's death. What is certain is this: the women's stories were never meant to survive. Their names were stripped, their voices erased. All that remains are fragments, a song hummed in a forgotten dialect, a scrap of embroidery hidden in the seams of a robe, a rumour carried by traders across distant lands. And yet, those fragments cut deeper than the grandest chronicles, because they remind us that, behind the image of empire, behind the blood-soaked banners and the roar of conquest, there were women kneeling in silence, their eyes lowered, their hearts still beating. The unanswered question remains: did any of them dream of freedom until the end? Did they pray for escape? Or did they carry their secrets to the grave, leaving us only to wonder? History does not tell us, but the silence itself is an answer.